Welcome, Mark.
Thanks for being here, and thank you, Jason, for inviting me, for the hospitality here at Google, and for the tour I got. And so first of all, I apologize to all of you for not showing up. You might be disappointed and show up in running clothes, you know. And also, and I know you do these author talks fairly regularly, and I unfortunately will not be able to give you the usual intellectual quotient. You know, this is not going to be major business strategy lessons. You know, we're not going to have sort of deep intellectual content. But you know, it's a beautiful summer day. It's about the nicest day we've had all summer. So we actually should all be out running, but you know, we'll spend a little bit of time chatting about the books. So what I actually thought I would do is just take 20 minutes or so, 20 minutes or half an hour, and talk to you a little bit about why I did these books, a little bit about the process, and then just talk about some of the favorite places that I have, sort of divided a little bit into the Brookline book and then the Boston book, and sort of group them around some themes around that. As a matter of fact, I'm going to grab one of each copies of the book for myself, just to refer to for a sec. Give me 1 second here. We ran out of the Boston books. Yep. Okay. So the genesis of the whole project was, as Jason mentioned, first of all, I am not a competitive runner. I'm not a fast runner. I'm not a distance runner. I'm sort of your everyday casual jogger. You know, I get up in the morning and creak myself out of bed and do my 4 or 5 miles. But it's something I've been doing, luckily, for 25 or so years, relatively injury-free. So I'm fairly fortunate on that front. But I'm also a fairly active. We do a lot of our family. We do a lot of biking. We do a lot of hiking, a lot of walking, and I noticed that for all of those other activities, there are guidebooks, there are route books. So there's 25. It's actually a very successful book for those of you who bike. Somebody wrote it about 20 years ago, named Howard Stone, who wrote this book, Great Bike Rides of Metrowest. It's sort of become the Bible of for bike riders out in sort of the Actons and Concords and Westons of the world, and it's been a very, very popular book. He's published about 10 or 11 different editions, updates of it. Similar books, AMC publishes guides to hiking, 25 great day hikes in New Hampshire. Every one of those activities has that sort of genre of book. But those books don't really exist for running, and it was sort of a bit of a puzzlement to me. And so I did some research, and there are a lot of books about running. There's a lot of books about how to run, how to train for a marathon, how to train for a triathlon. A lot of books about sort of technique and about exercise and how to stay healthy and how to stretch, all that stuff. But very few books about running routes. And so I thought, well, here's an interesting opportunity. And then the other thing is, and I realized a little bit about sort of the habits of running, and I thought, well, why aren't there books about running routes? And there have been just a few in a couple of other cities, but not very many. I said, well, first of all, runners are a bit creatures of habit. They tend to go from their house. It's not like biking or hiking or other activities. You'll drive to an activity. People have their set 1 or 2 routes that they do from around where they live. So I said, well, we have to sort of apply that. We can't sort of change people's behavior. So we have to sort of think about that, but apply it to what we do in the books. And so that's one of the reasons why, for example, so I said, well, this has got to be sort of a hyper-local sort of book. So that's one of the reasons why we wrote this book called Great Runs in Brookline and Vicinity, which includes sort of Brookline, JP, South Brookline, and just a little bit into Newton, which is why, not necessarily a massive market. I mean, people in Chicago are not going to go and buy this book. But on the other hand, there's a pretty good defined market, in and around Brookline, all the students and so coming. So, we were able to construct about 30 runs in the Brookline book that are within a mile or two of where anybody lives. And so we had to, in determining which communities we do, and as I look at other communities and as I look at even other cities, there are certain core characteristics we have to have in those cities for running books. First of all, there has to be fair density of population. The further out you go, actually, in Boston, out into Metrowest and so on, the harder it is to write a running book, routes for those towns, because there are fewer roads, and there are fewer routes that people could do near where they live. We had to be sort of a good density of runs from sort of near where people live. And it also has to do just with market size, with the population of a particular area, density and so on. And Boston's a great market. First of all, because it's been dubbed sort of America's walking city, so that equally applies to running. There's huge amounts that are actually new. Everybody thinks about Boston as old infrastructure, so there's actually a lot here that's new. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the routes that are sort of the new and undiscovered gems of running in Boston. And then, the other piece of it is we have a huge sort of what I call replacement market every year in Boston, just given the fact that so many students come here every year. And, this is a whole new market of people who are young and active, we hope, and looking to discover great new areas in Boston. And so that's a whole other sort of component about what makes Boston a city. I've thought about other cities to do this, and I think, well, how would I do this in Atlanta or Dallas or Houston or some of those other sort of real spread out, less densely populated cores, and that presents a bit of a challenge. So that's one of the reasons why I chose Boston. The other thing, one of the reasons I started with Brookline is that we moved to Brookline 2 years ago. We've lived in the Boston area for many years. We moved to Brookline around 2 years ago, and when people think about Brookline, they think about Beacon Street, they think about Harvard Avenue, they think it's congested and trafficy and all of that. But there are just within a few blocks of those central areas some incredible places to go. There's some beautiful residential neighborhoods. There are 3 notable ponds which have paths around them. There's the Emerald Necklace. There's the proximity to the river, and then you can get out into some of the more traditional residential suburbs like Newton and so on, and over into JP and South Brookline very, very easily. So that's one of the reasons we did Brookline. So process-wise, I did these books. I did 2 of them in the space of about 4 or 5 months. I should mention that this is not my day job, as most particularly first-time authors will say. As a matter of fact, in my day job, I've had a fair bit of interaction in relationship with Google over the years, because I'm a consultant in the wireless industry, and so I've spent a lot of time working with you guys and sort of your various sort of wireless initiatives over the years. So this has been sort of what I call my nights and weekends and early mornings job. I was sort of very disciplined about it. I set 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. every morning for about 5 months to sort of sit down and do these books. I did a combination of sort of using maps and doing a lot of research and just using routes that I knew. Plus, I also, every single step of every single run in both books has been charted on foot or by bike. So they've been measured very specifically, and you'll see that there's one thing you can go to Google Maps, and you can go to a site called Map My Run, and you can plot the routes fairly easily, but there's a lot of nuances that you can't pick up unless you really physically do the routes. I mean, in Boston, there's lots of places where the signage isn't very good. So you want to sort of say, well, here's a turn, but there's no sign, or here's a road, but the signage isn't very good. There's lots of confusing areas. I was very sensitive to which are, you can see 2 roads right together on a map. One might be much more pleasant to run along. It might be prettier. It might be nicer houses. Might be a better sidewalk. Might be better lit. So I really adjusted for all of those factors. And plus, we did other things you'll see in the way we structured each of the routes that, there's attention to not only length, but where is there water, where are there bathrooms? Not a lot of public bathrooms along a lot of these running routes, and so Starbucks, this is frequently mentioned. Here's the closest Starbucks. They're generally runner friendly in terms of letting people use their washrooms, sort of the modern day version of McDonald's on that front. And so that is sort of a little bit of the process. But every single route was sort of charted by foot or by bike, and it was a bit of a challenge because we did a lot of it this past winter. And it was a tougher winter from the standpoint of run for anybody who's a runner. It was a hard winter who trained for the marathon or something. It was a very difficult winter. It wasn't that there was that much snow or it was that cold, but it was just icy. And to try to find a day to do some of the charting on what I call the off-road paths. So the roads were okay, but anything sort of off-road, like along the waterfront or around Jamaica Pond or anything like that, you really I had to sort of just pick a day. Oh, hey, things have melted. It's a Wednesday. I'll have to just blow off work and chart some of these routes, and so we did that. So that was a little bit about the process. I decided also to self-publish this. I set up my own publishing company called Fresh Tracks Press. Not that there wasn't interest from publishers, there was, but those, I don't know if any of you here work in your initiatives related to the book business, but the book business does not run on internet time. The book business is actually quite antiquated in terms of its structure. And so when you talk to publishers, or even when you talk to distributors, like I just got a note from somebody from the company that's distributing my books, which is the entity that's responsible for getting them into the stores. And they are talking to me about their catalog now for the spring of 2010. And, you know, I knew that there was no way. I had this objective of doing the Brookline book and the Boston book fairly quickly. And there was no way that any publisher would have been on that schedule. I mean, we would have been releasing the books, you know, a year from now. And once I was sitting down and spending all the time on it, I wanted to get it out ASAP. So that meant I had to not only focus on the content, but I had to focus on the production side. I had to find somebody to do the book cover, find somebody to produce the books. I found a printer up in Canada, took a little bit of advantage of favorable exchange rates at the time, and lower labor costs up there, and got the books printed. And you know, that's the other thing, is just the whole process of printing and shipping and all that. It's, you know, it's very much rooted in sort of an old world. And a lot of people talk to me, well, why don't you do this more of an online internet? And you can do that, and there will be more of a sort of online component to this, but I really felt at the end of the day that it was nice for people to have something physical. There's something nice about having a book, and so that was a bit of the process. I set up my own publishing company. We printed the, you know, certain quotient in advance, and you know, we'll print more as orders come in, and you know, we've got a distributor now, so it's in a lot of the major bookstores now, and a lot of the athletic stores like Marathon Sports and so on, but it's going to be in a lot more starting in about a month, because we've got a distributor whose job is to get it into all the stores. I was doing some of that legwork myself for the first couple of months, because again, I got it out, and my goal was to have particularly the Brookline book was published in late February. The Boston book we published right in time for the marathon, and we did some work at a book signing on the day of the marathon, and some work at the Runners Expo related to the marathon, which was a great venue. But we're just now getting caught up with regards to getting the books distributed in all the places that they should be. So let me just talk to you a little bit about the format of the Roots and about some of my favorites. I'll just mention a couple of things about the format. First of all, you'll notice that, and I sort of went to great length and extra cost to make these books spiral bound, but with a spine. And the reason I did that is because I knew, again, as a longtime runner, you know, you're not going to take this with you when you go running, right? So what I did was I wanted to design it, you know, so if it's perfect bound, it means, you know, you would be stretching the pages, and it would be hard to sort of place them flat on a photocopier. So we designed them spiral bound, so you could easily put it on top of a photocopier and make copies of the paper, and you know, and take the paper with you. But the other thing that I was all set to go spiral bound. This is sort of the lessons you learn when you start publishing a book on your own, is that you also need to have a spine, because if you don't have a spine, then a bookstore can't display it, you know, like that. So it was a bit of a challenge to have the right infrastructure of a spine, and I'm probably sharing more detail about this than you need to know, but it's actually an interesting little thing that you learn about books. And then sort of the other thing from a structure perspective, I decided we're going to have a little bit of fun with this. So you'll notice as you look through the Roots, everyone has a bit of a theme. So people maybe can remember some of the runs. Each run has an overview with the distance and starting point, and you know, a bit of a description of the terrain, lighting. So a lot of people like to run at night or after work in the winter, and we wanted to make sure, well, this is a place you should or should not go running at night. I mean, we didn't say should or shouldn't, but we said, hey, these areas are lit and these areas are not very well lit. Are there public bathrooms or access to libraries or any sort of public infrastructure for bathrooms, water, and also just interesting sites along the way. And then a bit of a descriptive overview, and then detailed directions with mileage and turns emphasized, and then some nice maps. And I will mention a big thank you to Google. I actually received, early in the day of working on these books, I did receive permission from Google to use Google Maps free of charge in the books. I was actually a little bit surprised. I thought this was something that Google would, you know, would charge for, and I was all prepared to pay for that. But Google was kind enough to do that. On the other, I didn't end up using. I actually ended up licensing another map, not because the Google Maps weren't good, but they're actually more. They're better. They don't work well in a book format. So we actually license what's called a royalty-free map. We sort of call it a mapping company, and you sort of define a geographic area, and you license the map for that area, and then you can use it as many times as you want in a book. So that's how that whole process works. So that is the description of sort of the overview of each of these. And the other thing I did, you'll notice in both of these books at the beginning, there's sort of what I did was I developed a matrix, like in the let's just say in the Boston book. What would be the page number of that? Yeah, key distances. So at the beginning of each book, there's a description of how we did the runs and the overview. There's a list of best, some of my favorites, given different themes. And then each of the books has one of these matrices, and it looks a little bit complex. But I also thought, well, people want to have routes near where they live, but I also wanted to have sort of 4 or 5 key starting points for the bulk of the runs in each book. So, here are 4 or 5 key starting points, and here are the distances between those major starting points. So, for example, in Brookline, there's 4 key starting points for the routes, which are sort of major centers of Brookline: Coolidge Corner, Brookline Village, Washington Square, and Cleveland Circle. And we did the same thing for Boston with downtown locations. And so that's a little bit of the structure around that. We also have, again, some of what we call our bests or our favorites, depending on themes. We did a couple of other things, a little bit different. A little bit of the orientation is slightly different for the Boston book, a couple of different things. First of all, it's a little bit more geared towards not only just running, but walking and biking as well, because there's so many nice walks and sort of casual places to go bike riding in Boston. We also did a lot of it from the standpoint of some of the longer routes we divided into segments. So, for example, we've got the entire Harbor Walk in there, which actually now goes almost seamlessly from Charlestown to the University of Massachusetts, a little over 12 miles. And we figured, well, first of all, not that many people are going to do 12 miles in a given day, and very few people are going to do the round trip 12 miles. And so we have it in distinct segments. And the other thing we did with some of the routes, both in the Brookline book and the Boston book, is we have what we call T and back routes. So people could run one way and then take the T back. So we have that for some of the routes that make sense for those, like along Beacon Street and Com Ave and downtown and so on. The Southwest Corridor Park is another good one for that. You can run one way and then take the T back. And just remember to bring your Charlie card with you or whatever. So that's a little bit about the process and the formats of the book. Let me just sort of share with you some of the favorites. Why don't I start with Boston? And if you'll just notice in the table of contents for Boston, I actually decided, so how do we organize this? We have it organized geographically, or how do we do this? What I actually decided to do for Boston was organize it by 3 major categories for the sake, and there could have been numerous ways I could have done this, but there's 3 categories. One is called neighborhood runs, the other is Boston and the water, and then the other is what I call greenways, parks, and off-road paths. And there's certainly a Venn diagram aspect to this. There's overlaps between each of them. So the neighborhood runs, there's a couple of favorites there that I'd recommend. And first of all, how many of you live in Boston, within the city, or Boston or Cambridge? And Brookline, Newton, JP. Okay, so a fair bit of you live within that greater area. Okay, so good to start with Boston then. So some of the neighborhood runs, some of the ones that are real favorites. There's a great run. First of all, Charlestown in general is a bit of an undiscovered gem for running, and there's actually some interesting, as a result of the Big Dig, there's all these sort of new routes and new connections that are being made. So, for example, you can go from North Station over to Charlestown. Without having to sort of go over that trafficy Charlestown Bridge. There's a little ramp right next to the what's it called now? The Fleet Center? I can't keep track of what it's called, but whatever it's called, the big box where they play hockey and basketball. TD North, thank you. There's a little ramp, actually. There's a little road called Beverly Street Connector. There's a little ramp through these locks that take you right over to Charlestown, and then you're right along the water in Charlestown. There's a lovely run right along the water in Charlestown, all the way past the USS Constitution out to something called 16th Street. It's about 1.5 miles one way. So you can do that and then run up to Bunker Hill. That's a favorite area. And then there's also another ramp from that area, that Beverly Street connector, that goes over to the north end section of the Harbor Walk. And again, that eliminates that crossing of Washington Street and the Charlestown bridges and that sort of gnarly section right around there. There are just these sort of nice connectors. And true to Boston format. There's no signage whatsoever that tells you about this. So I think that's one of the other sort of values of these books, is that there are signs and very clear indicators in the books that don't really exist as much in the city. So that's a favorite one. We actually did a couple of other runs in the South End. One we called, just for fun, Gourmet Gallop, because it is a run along some of the main streets of the South End, which has all sorts of fun bakeries and restaurants. That takes you along some of the main roads of South Boston: Tremont Street, Columbus Avenue, Shawmut Avenue, and there's one other I'm blanking on right now. But that's a really neat area, and there's some really neat historic squares around there. And then the other run in South Boston is called South End, Back Roads of South End, which again takes you in all these little squares and sort of back roads, which are lovely. And I will say one of the challenges, and I've gotten a little bit of feedback on the books with regard to this, and admittedly so, this is probably the biggest challenge in designing running routes in sort of more densely populated and denser streeted neighborhoods, is that, like in the back roads of the South End or in the back roads around Coolidge Corner, there aren't a lot of roads that go on for a long way, for more than about a quarter mile. So a lot of these routes have, lots of sort of twists and turns, and you sort of have to do them a couple of times to get to know them. There's others that are a little bit more sort of, again, fewer turns, fewer directions. So that is one, complex aspect of doing it in certain neighborhoods. There's another one from Boston that goes from the Arnold Arboretum. If anybody here has ever run in the Arnold Arboretum around there, it's actually a beautiful area for running. 4 or 5 miles of totally closed to traffic, hills, beautiful trees and flowers, and neat connectors from Jamaica Pond through the Arnold Arboretum over to Franklin Park and into Forest Hill Cemetery. And there's one that actually goes out to Roslindale Center, which again, you wouldn't think about how easy it is to run to Roslindale Center, but run through the Arboretum, and it's just another mile along a very nice back road to Roslindale Center. And Roslindale Center is known for its cluster of bakeries. And so it's a fun, what we call Sunday morning thing to do, is to run out to Roslindale Center. It's sort of like biking. You have a nice muffin and then head back. There's something called Dip into Brookline, which is a run around some of the closer in neighborhoods of Brookline, which are very pleasant, around Coolidge Corner on either side of Beacon Street. That you can easily access from downtown Boston, from Kenmore Square. There's a run all the way out Beacon Street you can actually start at the State House and go all the way out to Route 16 in Newton, for those of you who are training for a long run or a marathon or want to do one way and take the T back. That's sort of charted by distance. There's something called Marathon Trainer, which goes out Com Ave one way, Route 30 one way, and then Beacon back, or you can do, the carriage roads are very much paralleling the marathon route. So those are some of the favorite runs in that section. Along the water, a couple of areas that I would emphasize. First of all, probably one of my favorite areas in all of Boston to go running is, from where I live, you have to sort of drive to it. So what I call it a special occasion sort of place, but it's in the South Bay area. Anybody run around there, around Carson Beach and Castle Island? It's absolutely spectacular. So this is an area. You just drive into South Boston. It's actually easy to connect if you just take the Summer Street Bridge over, where they built the new convention center, and just over there and down L Street, you're right there. And there's an absolutely gorgeous run around something called Castle Island, and then you run along what's called Bay Boulevard, past Carson Beach, and over to the JFK Library. That's about 5-6 miles one way. Gorgeous views of the harbor and of the bay, and water views the entire way. Tons of walkers, no traffic. It's just absolutely delightful. And again, that continues even from the JFK Library out to UMass, again, right along the water, beautiful views. And then there's a new bike path that they've built from near the end of that called the Neponset River Greenway. Anybody ever been on that from here? That runs all the way out to Milton, actually. It's about 3 miles, and it follows the last 3 or 4 stops of the Red Line. I remember Central Avenue on the Red Line. So anyway, that's a nice little route to do. So that's a favorite. Of course, doing the entire harbor walk is now very much possible and nice to do. You just have to decide, well, how many miles do you want to do in a given day? But you can start, at any section, and it's plotted specifically in the book to do that. But you can starts really at Charlestown, and they're even building it now further north. But part of it starts in Charlestown and then goes all the way again to the University of Massachusetts. It's about 12 miles. There's a couple of sections which take you off the main harbor walk, where there's still building out sort of public pathways. There's a couple of areas where the signage isn't that good. Where there's one area that actually says Harbor Walk this way, but then there's a huge gate, so you can't go there. So you have to sort of run along the street. And actually inquired as to why is that. Well, they're still trying to get permission from the Coast Guard to have access to that area. So that's still, the Harbor Walk thing is still a work in progress. What's neat about is that every single year there are new sections that open, and there's lots of activities that go along there. Along there, the whole Fort Point Channel section of the Harbor Walk is actually a bit of a spur from the main Harbor Walk near where the new Intercontinental Hotel is a neat area for those of you who live downtown. So that's really pleasant. Another what I would call undiscovered gem are two runs actually in East Boston. Now the biggest challenge about that is you can't actually get to East Boston by foot. You've got to take the T or drive. But in East Boston, there's a new bike path, which is lovely, believe it or not, near Logan Airport, that goes 3 miles. It's called the East Boston Greenway. And then there's, where the Hyatt Hotel is at Logan Airport. I'm sure some of you travel and you've seen it. But there's a lovely path that goes right around that and along what's called Harborside Drive. And again, the views of the city from there are absolutely spectacular and lovely. And then there's another area, again, an undiscovered gem for running. Again, you have to drive to it. Has anybody here ever run out on Deer Island in East Boston? So this is Deer Island is the Taj Mahal of waste treatment plants. They've built this giant, like billions of dollars waste treatment plant out in East Boston, but a lot of it's made out of sort of, it's been, I think it was a prison at one. There's a whole history to it. It's actually very interesting to go there just from the standpoint of that. But there's a 3-mile path right around that. Gorgeous ocean views the entire way. Great area for running. Don't go there in the winter. It's not plowed or maintained. I tried to actually plot this on a February day, and it was a little treacherous. But that's a great area if you're sort of looking for a nice thing to do on a weekend, just a walk with your family or a place to go running. It's really lovely. So that's and then another sort of neat undiscovered area. Again, this is, you're not going to run there obviously, but if you ever go to the Boston Harbor Islands, again, sort of an area that can something that's sort of continuing to improve every year. If you take a ferry out to what's called Spectacle Island, there are 5 miles of absolutely beautiful walking and running paths around that island. Ocean views the entire way, quite hilly actually, and there's not a set route on that island. There's about 5 miles worth of paths that they've developed, and again, I think it's just a bunch of landfill that they used from the Big Dig. That's now a national park and very easily accessed. I think it's only about 10 minutes from the city via ferry. So, and that's not open in the winter. It's only open, I think, May through October. And then a couple of other things around the Greenway. So, of course, we have everybody who thinks about running in Boston, of course, thinks of the Charles River Paths. So the Charles River Paths are given adequate treatment in the books with specific loops and mileage markers along there. A couple of other favorite areas. The whole Emerald Necklace is absolutely gorgeous for running, all the way from the State House to Franklin Park. That's a good long run. It's about 10 miles one way, but there's some particular sections of it that are nice. There's a couple of weird connection points that are not that easy to follow in terms of signage, but again, very clearly indicated in the book. But some lovely sections of the Emerald Necklace. The Fens is lovely to run around. That's about 3 miles around. The section between Brookline Village approximately and Jamaica Pond, and then around Jamaica Pond, is lovely. That's about 3 or 4 miles. And then Franklin Park. So if you run from Jamaica Pond through the Arnold Arboretum and then over to Franklin Park, again, Franklin Park is not an area where people think to go running, but if you live downtown, it's not that far to get out there. And once you're in Franklin Park, there's about a 3-mile a road that sort of goes around the park, half of which is completely closed to traffic, sort of in the back end of the park, dirt path, but very, very wide and lovely. And so this is all part of the Emerald Necklace and Olmsted's grand sort of vision for downtown Boston. So that's a neat area. And the other sort of a couple of other undiscovered parts of Boston, some of the old parkways, like the VFW Parkway, which actually I sometimes bike along early in the morning, has got actually a very wide sidewalk and a very wide shoulder and beautifully canopied. And there's a nice loop that I have people do along the VFW Parkway for part of it. And again, it doesn't give you visions of a beautiful run, but trust me, it's actually quite nice. And then you take something called Quarry Road, which goes up and over and actually in between 2 cemeteries. And if you hit that area right in the peak of fall colors, got some of actually the most beautiful trees I've seen in Boston. Just because of the way they're set on the hillside, and it's actually a very nice quiet street. And that's make a little note in the book about due in October. It's a really lovely run. So that on the other thing, sort of curious little story. There's a run in here you'll notice for Forest Hill Cemetery, which I've walked in before, and it's a lovely area. It's sort of not officially part of the Emerald Necklace, but the layout of it and the way it was designed sort of predates Olmsted and sort of designed around the same time as Mount Auburn. And unlike Mount Auburn, I actually called them before I put anything in the book. I said, well, this is a neat area to go walking, and I know you encourage people to come in here, and I just wanted to make sure that it's okay to go running in a cemetery. And they thought it was great, that they encourage people to go walking. It's a light recreational activity. They prefer people don't bike in there or play Frisbee or something, but they're totally okay with people running in there. And that's actually, again, an absolutely beautiful area. There's all these paths that go all around there. There are these outdoor sculptures. It's just a real gem. So as you can tell in the way I did these books, I really sort of tried to focus on, clearly the obvious places to go, but a lot of runners know about the obvious places. So I said, well, here's a few areas that maybe are a little bit less discovered. Let me just spend 5 minutes on the Brookline book and show you some highlights there. I wanted to leave some time for questions. I also didn't want to take too much of your time. But a couple of favorites in the Brookline book. First of all, one thing about running in Brookline, for anybody who runs in Brookline, it's very hilly. There are 7 hills in Brookline. We have a run in here called the 7 Hills Run. Do that. It's 10 miles, and that'll be a good workout for you. So there's 7 hills. There's a couple of sort of distinct parts of Brookline. And one thing about Brookline is you're always sort of a mile from either the Emerald Necklace on that side and the Charles River paths on the other if you want to sort of get to dedicated bike paths and water. There are 3 reservoirs either in or right near Brookline that have running paths around them. So there's the Chestnut Hill Reservoir in Cleveland Circle, and that's about 1.5 miles around. There is the Brookline Reservoir right at the intersection of Route 9 and Lee Street. That's 1 mile around and very pretty. You'd think, well, this isn't going to be so interesting. It's right on Route 9, but it's actually very pastoral and nice. And then there's Jamaica Pond, which is about 1.4 miles around, which again is quite near. And there's actually a route in here which has what we call the 3 ponds run. And you can do all of those 3 ponds and then sort of some nice connectors between them. And it's actually not as long a run as you would normally think if you start from somewhere central in Brookline. So that's a favorite. There are some lovely back roads near Brookline Village and near Coolidge Corner, sort of villagey roads that are fairly flat and have some nice homes that are going to get you off the main streets. The real objective in Brookline was to get people off sort of the main streets, except for Beacon Street, which actually is a lot more pleasant for running than people would think. If the sidewalks are wide, it's very well lit. It's actually one of the best places to go at night and in the winter. It's one of the first roads to be plowed in the winter. So that's an area. There's another area, one of the most exclusive. There's certainly a nice run in the Chestnut Hill section of Brookline, which borders into Newton. Quite hilly, beautiful homes, very, very quiet. That's a lovely area. But then there's another area. It's actually where John Henry, the owner of the Boston Red Sox, is building this. I mean, just to go on a run just to go by this construction site of a house. I mean, I've never seen a hole in the ground as big for a home as was in the ground for this house. But that's at the corner of Cottage Street and Warren Street. But there's this very sort of exclusive private residential area of Brookline that actually doesn't really have an official gate, but it has sort of a chain, sort of one of those things in front of it, and it says private road, no trespassing. But I see runners in there all the time, and I've seen the town trash trucks and the town plows go in, and so I said, well, if the town facilities are allowed in there to do those things, then people should be able to run in there. So I actually did a run. I actually call it Sergeant Road Confidential in the book, just to have a little bit of fun with it. And I haven't been arrested or shot at or sued yet for running in there, but it's actually a very, very nice area for running. Very, very beautiful homes and quiet. The area around Lars Anderson Park, both Lars Anderson Park as well as some roads around that are lovely for running, as well as the Aspen Wall. If you want to do some hills, one of the sort of oddities about Brookline, or for anybody who lives or knows Brookline, it's one of the first residential suburbs of Boston, and parts of it were Olmsted designed, and there were some 19 different stair paths that were built in Brookline that take you from the top of certain hills like Aspinwall Hill or Quarry Hill or Summit Hill down onto the main streets. And so there are lots of details in these books about where those stair paths are, the altitude gained, and how many steps there are, and so on. So if you ever were looking to do some hill work, those are great places. If you ever want to do some a serious singular hill on a road, go to Summit Avenue, which is right near Coolidge Corner, and that's about 300 feet, pretty much straight up. If you do that a couple of times, that'll get your lungs going in the morning. That's a great one. But those stair paths are both architecturally interesting, as well as interesting, just fun from the standpoint of running. Again, got to be cautious about what you do in the winter. And then even in the Brookline book, there's a little bit of an overlap with a couple of the runs in the Boston book around the Charles River paths and Beacon Street and around the Emerald Necklace. So you'll find a little bit of overlap there. And then another sort of nice residential neighborhood I'll conclude with is what we call the Flats and Hills of Fisher Hill. There's a residential area called Fisher Hill, which has got some incredible hilly sections, but also some of the longer, flatter, quieter roads in Brookline. So it's nice to sort of combine those, or do the hilly part or the flat part, depending on your mood in a given day. I don't know about. That looks like a lot of you run. I'm getting a lot of nodded head. You know what it's like. On a given day or in a given morning. Sometimes you're sort of in the mood for something. Sometimes you're in the mood to do something a little bit more vigorous and do hills. Sometimes you're in the mood to do a faster or tempo run. Sometimes you're in the mood. If it's a nice snowy day, you want to do something along a residential street where it's treed and it's pretty. In other cases, you do something more special near the water or something. So I find that as a runner. One of the other reasons I did this book is, frankly, for somebody who's been running in this area for 25 years, and as you know, if you're runners, you can get bored easily, and so it's fun to just sort of mix it up and have some variety. And I think that keeps things fresh. I think that applies to any sort of physical activity. So, and particularly with running, which can be, I think, sometimes a solitary and lonely pursuit, and this sort of adds a little bit of variety and fun to it. So why don't I stop there? Hopefully I've shared with you some of those neat and favorite areas. Again, thanks so much for coming. Enjoy some of the routes in the book. I would welcome any feedback. In the Boston book, there is the website and my email address. Please feel free to give me feedback if there's something that is mislabeled or is changed or is wrong, or find an additional if you find an additional little road or section that you think is better than what I've been able to put together, or you have your own suggestion for a run, I would give you credit. We're actually going to be going to a second printing of both of the books in probably the fall, so I have an opportunity to add some additional ones and some revised ones, and we're going to do a little bit online with that as well. So again, would welcome anybody's feedback, and I'm happy to take some questions. And if you'd like, I'm happy to sign a book for you if you'd like. I'll stick around for a while afterwards. But again, thanks so much for coming. Any questions about any of these routes, or yeah?
So you mentioned the Forest Cemetery, and do you know what the take is on other cemeteries?
Yeah, because I'm actually working on the what I call the third of the trilogy, but that'll be it for Boston, which is sort of in what I call an uber suburb book, because we're going to cover a cluster of suburbs all in one book. So I actually called Mount Auburn Cemetery a week ago to ask them, and they actually have a bit of a different view on this. They actually do not encourage people to go running in there. Walking is fine, of course, but running is not really encouraged. So we're not going to put. I might put Mount Auburn Cemetery in the book just as, hey, this is a nice place to go walking once we're sort of doing stuff in Cambridge, but not for running. Yeah. So, the way I have to think about the burbs is it has to be sort of a cluster of nice places to run, and I can't. I think, well, I could do one for like Newton and Wellesley, and I could do one for Concord, and I could do one, but there's not enough of a market for any one of those to add up to enough of a market to justify the cost of doing it. So what I thought that I would do is I'd sort of build in sort of what I'd call a cluster of suburbs, and so my thinking is really to do sort of a western suburb orientation on Newton, Wellesley, Needham, Weston, and then Lexington, Concord, some of Belmont, some of Cambridge, some of Waltham, and then maybe a little bit north, sort of around parts of Medford and some of around the Mystic Valley Parkway and so on. I figure if I sort of do that, then I've covered a good part of the inside of Route 128, and I've got to have sort of enough towns that it adds up to enough of a market for the book and enough distribution points. But it also has to be, again, the book will not be successful if I just do 2 runs in each of those towns. It has to be 10 or 15 runs per community that I do, sticking to the hyper-local aspect of why people will buy the book. Again, I don't think somebody will buy the book if they, here's 2 or 3 runs in my town, but I already know these. If it's got places in their town and where somebody lives that are a little bit undiscovered and also goes into neighboring towns, I think then that provides sort of an attraction to somebody to buy the book. Again, that's my thinking. I'd welcome thoughts and feedback on that, or additional communities that you think I should cover. But I could go all the way up to the north. I have to sort of pick my spots. Part of them that I know, and also how much sort of work is involved, and again, enough roads and places to go and so on. So that's all part of the thinking around it as well. But that's the current plan. Yeah. It was actually more the opposite. There were more pleasant discoveries than unpleasant discoveries. My biggest frustration really was the sort of just amazing lack of signage in really obvious places. For example, the Emerald Necklace, which is this gem that's been around 100 years. There are some places where, unless you really know, how do you get from like the end of Commonwealth Avenue over to the Fens, for example. There's no signage. There's no markers. There's no distances. There's really it was more frustration around poor lack of signage, and in some cases poor maintenance of certain parts of the trail. That was sort of the biggest disappointments. But in terms of routes, there were more pleasant discoveries. There are some areas that I would have liked to have done more. So there's some communities, so like for example in JP, it's a very dense, very tight community. There aren't a lot of places outside of a couple of the roads around the center and then along the Emerald Necklace that I could sort of do for JP, even though a lot of people live in JP, and I think they feel a little bit short-shrifted in the book. But you sort of have to go with, what are pleasant areas, and also what is runnable. I mean, there might be interesting neighborhoods that are nice for walking, but if you're having to, turn a corner every, minute or so, that's not very what I call runner friendly. The other thing I'm thinking about is what I do, and here we are sitting in Cambridge at Google's offices. But what do I do for Cambridge? You've got the Charles River paths, you've got Fresh Pond, you've got Fresh Pond parts, the paths now around Fresh Pond Parkway. I am trying to figure out what to do about other sections of Cambridge and the extent of the treatment I give Cambridge in the book in terms of the neighborhoods. Like, do I do stuff around Porter Square? What do I do about this neighborhood around here, which is, I don't know, outside of the river? I find a little bit sketchy for running. You might, but again, that's my hypothesis. But I'd welcome sort of disagreement on that or suggestions. So, yeah. Well, if you only have an hour. The obvious one is along the Charles River paths, and that's lovely. What most people would probably do is head west towards Harvard Square, I would imagine. If you have maybe an hour and a half, or you want to drive 5 minutes away or something, I mean, you can run east from here, or just to do something a little bit different than just the Charles River path. You can run east into the city, down to the North Station. There's actually a nice new connector from sort of the Science Museum over through North Station. A couple of new little paths that they've built around the Spalding Rehab Hospital, and then you can go into Charlestown and do the nice run past the USS Constitution, and then even up to Bunker Hill. That's a nice long loop, but that's an easier connection to make than people would normally think. You can get onto the Harborfront paths from there as well. So that's sort of a nice discovery from here. You could cross over one of the bridges. You could cross over the River Street Bridge and go into Brookline. And there's a couple of nice runs around some lovely residential neighborhoods in Brookline. You can go into the North End and Back Bay along Comm Ave. So you can do a loop where you sort of go along cross one of the bridges and go along the river one way and along Comm Ave the other, and then up through the garden and the Common up to the State House and sort of loop your way back. So there's, one of the things about the book is that, again, these are suggestions for specific routes, but they're also hopefully guides. So people, I find, will use these as guidelines to then improvise and add their own routes, because that's where all the mileage stuff and so on will get thrown off a little bit. But again, these are meant to sort of just expose areas to people as much as specific routes. So if you're running into Boston, going with the Museum of Science on your right or on your left, are you coming from the city and coming back into Cambridge, or are you come? If you just go right by the Science Museum, with Science Museum on your left. On your left, yeah. where the parking where the duck tours start and the buses are always parked. You go along there, and then you go left, right where the sort of Cambridge side Galleria is, Land Boulevard, and then it's quite clear where there's a path, and then it goes right along the water, sort of in front of the Royal Sonesta Hotel, right around here, and then and then you can cross back over on one of the bridges, cross back over on the Longfellow Bridge or the BU Bridge or the Harvard Bridge. So there's some good indications in here about specific loops and specific mileages. Yeah, thank you.